Excellent. And we've got 200 attendees and it's starting to slow down. Nā mai, haere mai. Welcome to this webinar. What is the line of creepy? I really appreciate people coming on a Friday afternoon. I know it's been a long week for everybody. I am Emma MacDonald. I am at the Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation, which is based here at Stats New Zealand, and we're part of the role of the Government Chief Data Steward. Under her mandate to be able to lift the capability of data ethics across the whole of government. I am here with my colleague Fiona Wharton, who will pick up in a wee minute, and we hope that you are going to enjoy this session. The Privacy Act details about what you can do with personal information, what is legal. But as people are interested in data ethics, we start in asking the question, just because we can, should we? So this year's Privacy Week theme, Privacy on Purpose, really called to us because we're very much about pausing after the can we to actually think about the should we, which is always the ethics question. So we give information to people in all different ways. It can be little amounts of information, it can be big pieces of information about ourselves. And it may be because we want a service that we're compelled to, or that we have a need to be able to tell our story because we want to. But sometimes we're also not even aware that we're giving this information about. And so I'm going to start the seminar with just a couple of hypothetical questions around what is possible under the current Privacy Act to actually see how you're feeling about these. Some people will feel comfortable, some people won't. So within a retail store, you can legally have facial analytics used, and they can track you, how you're going down the aisle, what products you're picking up and having a bit of a look at. They can even estimate your age and your gender. And as long as they have a sign at the beginning of the shop saying that they're doing this, it is perfectly legal. Does that feel a little bit creepy to you? What about within your fitness app? It is possible for a fitness app to track you, not just when you're working out, but at all times, because they've put in paragraph 17 of their privacy policy that they can do that. And so at what point does the tracking turn into creepy for you? It may never turn into creepy, but it also may. If these scenarios make you feel uncomfortable, we're hoping that actually this webinar will help with your thinking around the different things. About what questions you want to ask around your own private information. But also, if you're a person that's collecting information, also thinking about what is going to make other people feel uncomfortable? What is okay for them and what's not okay for them? So we're going to hear from three guests that are part of the wider Centre for Data Ethics and Innovations Network, and they're all extraordinary storytellers. And so we're going to have Charlie, Annie, and Heather tell some of their stories, and we're going to explore what is the human side of personal information and how it's collected and how it's used. We want to create a safe space for people to be able to listen and to honour the different worldviews and experiences that you'll hear today. To this end, you would have noticed that we advertised that this will not be recorded. So that's just to be able to protect personal stories and allow Charlie, Annie, and Heather to be able to answer your questions in a really free and open way and actually give them the space to be able to have these conversations. However, we've had a conversation with them, and if everyone feels comfortable and gives consent at the end, we will look at releasing the video. But we just want to make sure that it's in a space where people can talk freely, and then if people don't feel comfortable with it, then we won't release it. There will be a lot of time for questions at the end, and so I'll be monitoring the Q&As at the end. I'm going to be picking the people who are upvoted the most as the questions that I go to first, so please remember to upvote any questions that you like. That's really interesting. There's also the ability to make yourself anonymous if you want to, so use that as well, so that if you don't want your name put across onto it. At that stage, I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who's going to give a little bit of an introduction to this session, and I hope you enjoy it.
Kia ora. Thanks, Emma. Well, as Emma was saying, and you all know, today we live in a world where there is so much information being collected about people. in so many places and in so many different ways, apps on our phone, cameras on the street, the websites that we interact with, and now some of our data is being used to train AI models. So many of us probably are completely unaware of just how much data is held on us by different businesses and agencies that we interact with, let alone the different purposes that data might be being put to use or the decisions that might be being made about us based on that information. But behind all this data is people and communities, and that's what we're all about. And the thing is that when lots of information about a person is collected, it begins to tell a story about them. But is that story accurate? And who gets to tell that story? So do we even know what people feel about their information and what is done with it? Well, there's actually been quite a few studies and engagements across New Zealand asking New Zealanders these kinds of questions. One of them was your voice, your data, your say. It was run in 2018 by the Social Investment Agency, who physically moved around the country asking people, what do we need to do, particularly as government, to protect the information that you give us, and how do you want it to be used? And so while different people and groups placed emphasis on different things, the research found people want things explained in a way that they can understand, and they want to be able to ask questions. People want to have a say about their data and how it is used and by whom. People want to be respected as people, not as numbers. People talked about feeling vulnerable sharing information, and some felt like they didn't get given a real choice. Some people were worried that information might be used against them, and others wanted really holistic approaches that reflected their worldviews. A lot of the feedback focused on people, putting people and whānau at the centre and not being judged or discriminated against. People want to be listened to. They want people to understand their needs, and they wanted the chance to be involved in the decisions made about them. So in response to this, the SIA developed the Data Protection and Use Policy, or we call it DPUP. It attempted to genuinely incorporate the voices that they'd heard and provide an ethical framework for people working with other people's information. The DPUP has a focus on people and well-being that's built on trust, respect, and transparency. It's centred on 5 principles. He tangata, so it's all about people and about their well-being and improving their lives. Manaakitanga, so respecting and upholding people's mana and dignity. Mana whakahaere, which is about empowering people, giving them choice and enabling them to access and use their own data and information. Kaitiakitanga, so acting as a steward in a way that people understand and trust. And mahitahitanga, so working as equals to create and share valuable knowledge. The DPUP principles and guidelines, they're all consistent with the Privacy Act, but they also recommend ethical practice that is beyond what the law requires. So 2 examples, ensuring that inclusive voices are sought when defining new purposes for data, and telling people what the information won't be used for, as well as what it will be used for. So this is one of the ethics frameworks that we promote as the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. But there are many others. Sort of ethics basically considers principles such as justice and fairness, equity and inclusion, understanding and respect. And those questions like, do benefits outweigh the harm, and who gets the benefits? It asks the question, just because we can, should we? An ethics lens asks us to treat people's information as taonga and build trusted relationships that help people to feel safe when sharing their information and stories. It might be easy to see that special care is needed for some people who could be more vulnerable to harm when lots of data is collected about them. So maybe some disabled people who rely on a lot of different services across the network, and at each of those different services, information is being gathered. People like children who have data collected about them that's usually provided by adults and goes on to inform the rest of their lives. But there are other aspects to consider when we think about the human side of information, like how people view their own data, which might be very different to how we think and view our own data. Sometimes we need to be deliberately curious as to how others might see the world differently to us. In our last newsletter, we asked people from different cultures and backgrounds this question: what does the word data evoke in your culture? What ideas, values, or traditions come to mind? The insights we got back were fascinating. Many people talked about traditions of storytelling that carries the voices of those who came before us, threads linking past, present, and future, preserving generational knowledge, communal memory, and forming a collective story of many voices. Others talked about data holding emotional, spiritual, and collective meaning and connection to the land. Data was described as identity and as a form of visibility, justice, and equality. In our work, we're privileged to hear a lot of stories from many different people and communities. And in hearing these, we've had a lot of moments. These have expanded our thinking and stretched our understanding. What we've tried to do in designing this webinar is to give you the opportunity to hear some of these stories that provide insight into the human side of information collection. First up, we're going to hear from Charlie about experiences within the trans community. Then Annie will talk about her research with former refugees and migrants. And finally, Heather is going to share some insights into older people with a particular lens on AI. We invite you to lean in, listen, and reflect on these stories. And maybe you will have your own moment. First, I'd like to introduce you to Charlie. Charlie is a wonderful human being, service designer, policy expert, and I'm going to hand it over to him to introduce himself. Over to you, Charlie.
Kia ora koutou, ko Charlie Pratt-Tokuunga. My pronouns are he and him, and they, them. So I have a history of, especially in my younger years, working within supporting people in the trans community, and I generally have an interest in data and especially around access to gender-affirming healthcare. So my talk today will focus on the impacts for trans and non-binary people when organizations aren't transparent around what information those organizations hold about a trans or non-binary person, and also when an agency or an organization decides on behalf of that trans and non-binary person what their identity details are, e.g. their name and their gender should be listed at. I just want to do a quick note around language. Just for this talk, I use the terms trans and non-binary, and transgender all interchangeably to mean anybody who identifies as a gender that was different than they were identified at birth. And please note that does include takatapui and other Indigenous third genders as well. So all trying to be as inclusive as possible, but noting that this is my experience of being a trans mass person, a Pākehā trans mass person, and what I've observed. So I don't want to speak on behalf of the entirety of the trans community. I'm going to start off with a recent story that I had. Anybody who's ever gone through changing their name knows how difficult it is to update different agencies and organizations around that. To be fair, I changed my name a long time ago and my gender marker, but I recently got a flu shot, and in that I looked at the screen because I provided my NHI. It linked to that, and there was a database that had my name, which was my mother's last name recorded, and then my birth name, and it also had female down. So I went on the quest to try to get that updated. I rang Health New Zealand. They said email somebody. The person I emailed at Health New Zealand then said, "Now go to your GP." I went to my GP, and my GP said, "Oh, yep, your NHI number got updated to male. The gender marker in your NHI number got updated to male in November last year. Did something happen there where it got updated?" And I was like, "Nope." And so basically where I'm at is I don't know what the health system has my gender linked as, I know my GP has something, my NHI now has something, but this database that recorded properly my immunization record has something completely different. And what I'm going to talk about is why this one example impacts my community. So this kind of comes down to the lack of transparency, and also in my case where somebody has decided what my gender was on behalf of me without actually consulting me, which I describe as a lack of self-determination or a lack of recognition. So these two concepts basically impact trans people for safety reasons, and a concept that I've come up with called recognition, which is around being able to be seen in the micro and the macro as your authentic self. Apologies. One sec. Sorry, that is my dog. Sorry. Apologies about that. Apologies about that. So as I was saying, safety is really important in this stage, especially with the state of the world at the moment. Trans people, as you can find through the Counting Ourselves results, face high discrimination on an individual level and also within service, and face higher rates of violence than their cisgender peers. And when there's this data floating around that can out somebody as being trans, it can often lead to that discrimination, and especially if you're not aware of it being there. And that goes for previous names as well, in which there was a case a couple of years ago where an agency sent a whole bunch of letters to people in their birth names, which then led to some people being outed, unfortunately. And those people weren't aware that that information was still being held by them. And then the second implication is recognition. And for this, I want to go back to what is the point of collecting gender in general, right? And there's kind of 3 or 4 reasons. Statistical, which is basically in order to be seen, and like things like the census, it's really important to be able to collect gender, and especially trans identities, because then that leads to actually being able to respond to our needs. Operational, and I split this into social and health. Especially in health, a gender dictates kind of the types of services you need, e.g., whether you need a pregnancy test or whether you need particular cancer screenings and things that could occur for you. And for example, a trans person, when dealing with services, say a social service, they may want to be known as male, but for a health service, they want to be known as female. And that's one. With the health service, it's because they want to be checked in for cancer screenings and make sure that the IT system will work so test results can go through. Because sometimes that doesn't happen if your gender doesn't match what the test should be for. And then for social services, they don't want to experience discrimination, so they just put down as male. And then lastly, identity. So passports, not a New Zealand driver's license, but birth certificates, they can train people's gender and therefore identity purposes. So trans people are really deliberate of what gender they want to use in certain situations, because it can lead to, just going back to the previous point, lead to discrimination and violence or harm to them if they don't get particular health needs met. And if they're not aware of what information an agency holds about them, or an agency decides on their behalf to change that gender or change that name, that basically leads to safety implications for the community, for individuals in the community, as well as a concept called misrecognition, which people aren't seen as themselves, and they're not given the agency to basically choose how they almost want to interact with those services. That choice is taken away from them. So in my case, where somebody decided my NHI should just be changed, I'd purposely left it as female for a long time because I had some weird, frustrating interactions when I'd had particular cancer screenings, because 1, they don't notify you if you're male in your NHI, and 2, they don't, IT systems don't work in terms of being able to send off test results. So when they changed that purposely, that when the person, whoever did it, had changed my gender on my NHI, I had that agency and that choice taken away from me when it was a very informed, deliberate choice. So I'm all about positivity and trying to make things better. So rather than just complaining about what's happening, for me, what needs to happen is it all comes back to Principles 7, 8, and 9 of the Privacy Act. And just to remind those on the call what those are, those parts of those principles in the Privacy Act is what information agencies being clear relates to people being clear about what information agencies hold about them, people being easily able to update the information. I shouldn't have to go through 3 different methods to try to find out what my NHI number says and how to update it. And lastly, ensuring that information is accurate. This one's a bit more complicated because some would argue that information was in previously accurate. And then for me, this comes back to there is no necessary standard around how people should keep previous identity documents and previous information around gender, which may have been correct at the time, and then what's the implication for that. So put simply, people should be aware of what information all agencies hold about them, have the ability to update this information, and choose what name and gender is recorded in a particular organization's or IT system. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, just the importance of that dignity of self-choice, and being enabled. Our next speaker, so if you've got questions for Charlie, please pop them in the Q&A. I'll introduce our next speaker, Annie Chiang. Annie is a professional teaching fellow and research fellow at the University of Auckland, and she's about to sit her oral exam for her PhD. Her PhD research looked at missingness in government-collected data sets. Annie has a keen interest in rights and responsibilities to count and be counted. Over to you, Annie.
Kia ora. Thanks, Fiona. Ko Taiwana te tauina whakapapalanga mai, engari ko Tamaki Makaurau te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te kāinga, he kaitono tohu kairangi o I Waikapato Matarau, ko Annie Chiang. So my name is Annie and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Auckland. That is the hat I'm wearing today, at least, and hopefully not for very much longer. As Fiona mentioned, my thesis is I'm not sure if you mentioned it. Anyways, my thesis is looking at government collected data sets with a special interest in those who are missed. So just as Charlie was talking about the right to know what information is collected about you and the right to have agency around your data, I have a particular interest in partly people who exercise the agency to not be collected, but also the flip side of that, and what I'll actually be speaking to a little bit more today, it's people who don't have that agency because this kind of what data means to them or how they view their data, that data probably just isn't in their sort of perspective or purview at all, because data is, I think, something that we can consider when we've kind of met all the other needs in our lives. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in that relationship between the state and citizens in the broader sense. So for us as individuals living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what role does our data play in our interaction with government, and how is that data used to serve us as people that the government has a duty of care to? So citizens, it's not if anyone's kind of here from INZ, ignore that definition, it's just a broader sense. So my thesis was a bit of a 3-parter. I did look at our legislative framework. I'm not going to talk about that today. I did look at the census and the Statistics New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure, because that's where my background is. I was an IDI researcher, well, still am an IDI researcher, but then that's kind of where I was, I guess, more comfortable. But there was a story that was still left untold, which is, we can look at the data, we can look at what the legislation says that we can and cannot do, but ultimately it is, how do people feel about their data being collected? And if you want to or you don't want to have your data collected, what does that even mean? So the last phase of my research, I went out and interviewed some people that would be considered difficult to enumerate, or rather I guess the phrasing that I used, and I think it was probably more true, is that the people that the government have failed to count or have failed in general. And the reason why I characterize that is because for the individuals that I interviewed, most of them were from former refugee backgrounds and with some from Māori and Pacifica communities. But these are individuals who, they just face such profound barriers to engaging with public services that there's a chance that they might be absent from our data sets. And so the reason why I say that is because if we're looking exclusively at government collected data, anything except, say, the census or like a survey that is designed and gone out, that we're sampling people deliberately, anything other than those, what we'll be working with is administrative data sets. So, things that enable the public agency to do their jobs. It's not designed for the purposes of counting people living in New Zealand. And so it's kind of incidental, and only people who engage are included in those data sets. However, those are the data sets quite often that, public agencies are actually using to guide their decision making and policy making. And so the idea is that if you are someone who is not engaging in their data in with a public service, they will not have information about you. So for those who do not require the service, not a problem. If you do not require, health services because you are in good health, more power to you. But what if you are someone who actually requires that care, but you are just unable to get to that point of, engaging with the health system? What does that mean for you? So in the case of the refugee families that I talk to, I personally my parents are from Taiwan. We immigrated here, 30 odd years ago. We have no problems accessing, I personally don't have any problems accessing healthcare, but my parents certainly had issues with, overcoming language barriers to accessing care. And so that was my, I guess, understanding of what a language barrier might be. But when I spoke to these families, it was even more profound than that. It's thinking about, when you walk out your front door and you want to access public transport, you require some language proficiency for that very interaction to get to the hospital. If you want to make an appointment, you need to be able to request an interpreter if it's over the phone. You need to be able to, even face-to-face, communicate which language you speak. And if your language that you speak is not directly correlated with the country of that where you come from or your country of origin, chances are we're going to have a really, difficult time finding an appropriate interpreter for you. And that was the case for a lot of the families that I spoke to. They come from places where there is no written language, so they've never had experiences learning to read or write, and they do not speak a common language, and the only interpreter is actually just their friend that is, just happened to be the one that was able to pick up the language once they moved here. And so if that one friend is not available, then they are not able to access service. So it just, that kind of experience or their experience really just opened my eyes to the fact that when it comes to data, we're not just thinking about agency, we're also thinking about, those basic day-to-day things. Are we enabling people to be part of this data ecosystem through our provision of services and having things being accessible? But I might leave it there. I feel like I've been talking. I feel like I didn't even take a break, and I will pay my dog tax later. So I might pass it back to you, Fiona, for now.
Thank you, Annie. And I think, those insights were really powerful and helpful for us to gain insight too. So I hope that that's the same for some of you on the call. Next up, we have Heather Newell. So to introduce Heather, she has experience supporting NGOs and the use of data through the Matakiti Online Trust of New Zealand. She is a long-time local body councillor, and this year she has also enrolled in a PhD at Massey University. Heather is going to be studying the impact of AI on older people and the organisations that serve them. Heather is an advocate for older people in our communities, and she has deep insights into how they think about information, data, and new technologies. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that intro. As you mentioned, I thought I would just a couple elaborate a little on some of the organisations that I'm involved in. So, number of groups around that serve older people, and particularly with digital inclusion, exclusion issues. SeniorNet has been part of my life since just before the COVID. And I also go to a weekly social kaumatua group at our local marae, Arongamai in Upper Hutt. And in the past, I've been involved in Office for Seniors Digital Inclusion Group. And more recently, I've enrolled in this doctorate, The Impact of AI on Older People and Their Organisations. And much more recently, I've been involved and very enthusiastic about the role of the new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So, creepy and older people. I'm going to make some significant generalizations, which, considering our topic is probably creepy in itself, but seeing as I'm now classified myself as an older person, I think I'm allowed a little leeway. So in general, and I include myself in this, older people can be quite compliant. If someone asks us to do something, we tend to do it. Think the census, for example, loyalty cards, surveys, and simply handing over our contact information, left, right, and centre. So how often do we ask, as seniors, how often do we ask where this information is actually going and whether I even have the right, the opportunity to say no to providing it? So I want to move on to something really creepy, and that is AI. And oh my God, I just returned from an annual conference concerning older people and digital technology, and was not surprised to hear that AI was a very hot and a very enthusiastic topic. Unbelievable enthusiasm for its benefits, but absolutely no mention whatsoever of its downsides. And no presentations on the subject. I suggested that each member organisation ought to have a governance policy on the use of AI, and they all looked at me as if I dropped off Mars. No one wanted to hear about this. But it seems like a new phenomenon, but it's not. Back in 2020, Erica Pearson and Esther Jaspers of Massey University conducted a study of our privacy concerns and behaviours regarding domestic IoT, like Alexa, for example. They reported on an international survey which found that 63% of people found, and this is a really relevant quote, wait for it, connected devices are creepy. Ooh. And 75% do not trust the way their data is being shared by these services. So Erica and Esther identified a privacy paradox, which I think is quite interesting, in which users' stated privacy concerns do not align with their actual behaviors. This paradox is about the fact that people realize that their data is being used somewhere, but they take a pragmatic approach on the basis that there are so many ways that data is being scraped, gleaned and shared that a little bit more sharing really is hardly significant. So the survey, just as a note, also found a high level of privacy fatigue. So what are my worries? And I'm sure you all know it, but we are handing over our data without a care in the world. And we don't even know that we're handing over our data. And of course, someone out there is making a profit off of our data, and we don't know where it is going and why it has some value. How creepy is that? Let's face it, the potential for bias in AI, especially affecting older people, is something we should be considering more. Try asking for a picture or an illustration of older people through AI and see what you get. And try asking for a picture that includes an older Maori or Pacifica person and see what you get. So how do we get around this? I know there's the algorithm charter, but until about a year ago, I didn't even know what an algorithm was. And I'm sure lots of older people don't know what it is and why it's important. And strangely, that this word data, when I talk to a lot of older people, their eyes glaze over at the word data. So I've been trying to use the word information to try and get people to think more about what it means to them. It's their information that's being given, not data, because they don't know what data is. Older people have a good concept of the Privacy Act, I think. But to date, very little discussion about AI and data protections and what happens to our data when we share our deepest, darkest thoughts and issues with something like Claude or Alexa. Do we know where that's going and what's happening? So I have two final suggestions for who might take on the role of educating our older sector. My suggestion is that we turn the DPUP policy that's been generated by government, and we try and turn that into a charter that any agency, any non-profit, any fundraising agency can actually turn into something manageable that they can issue out to their recipients, their members, the people that they're asking for information. And this might be in the form of a template charter. And oh, funnily enough, I've drafted something. So if anyone wants to find me and ask me for a copy of the charter, I could easily provide it. Secondly, I think that we must promote a single body that is recognizable for its concerns around data ethics and innovation. So finally, I'm going to put a plug out for something that is not creepy in this space, and it is Enter the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. Thank you very much. Back to you, Fiona.
Sorry, wasn't expecting a plug. Thank you. Yeah, the idea of privacy fatigue is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Thank you for all your thoughtful comments there on creepy and non-creepy and some potential ways forward.
Thank you all for coming. Heather, Annie, Charlie, thank you so much again for the generosity of your time and the insights. It is always amazing when we get to spend time with you to actually just learn how to think about things differently from perspectives where we don't necessarily have the lived experience, or we haven't talked to people with the lived experience so that we can understand what this looks like. And so for the people who have come along today, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I'm just going to leave you with a bit of a wera or a challenge on that. If you have influence over how information is collected or in using other people's information, whenever you're picking that information up, I just leave you to ask the question of, even if we can, should we? Always ask, should we? So thank you all very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you would like to get in contact with either me or Fiona, just ping us an email at dataethics@stats.govt.nz. We're always happy for a bit of a conversation. Excellent. Ngā mihi nui.